The musket ball whistled past Betty Morgan's ear as she pressed herself against the ship's mast, her wedding dress torn and stained with salt water and blood. The governor's ship had found them at last, cannons blazing across the churning Caribbean waters. Louis King stood at the helm of his vessel, the Serpent's Kiss, his dark hair whipping in the wind as he barked orders to his crew. This was the moment she had dreaded and somehow longed for, the inevitable confrontation between the life she had chosen and the one that had been forced upon her. 3 months earlier, she had stood in Governor Samuel Turner's opulent mansion in Port Royal, her hands trembling as she faced the most impossible choice of her young life. The mahogany walls seemed to close in around her as Turner's cold eyes assessed her like livestock at market. Her father's debts had sealed her fate, and now at 22, she was to be bartered away to settle accounts that had nothing to do with her own choices. "Miss Morgan," Governor Turner had said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "your father's gambling has left quite a considerable debt to the Crown. However, I am prepared to offer you an alternative to debtor's prison." He gestured toward 3 men standing in the corner of his study, each representing a different path her life might take. "You will choose one of these gentlemen to marry. The union will settle your family's obligations." Betty's stomach had turned as she looked at her options. Eric Howard, a plantation owner whose cruelty to his slaves was whispered about in every drawing room in Jamaica. His eyes held a coldness that made her skin crawl. Brandon Nelson, a merchant whose first 2 wives had died under mysterious circumstances, stood beside him with a smile that never reached his eyes. And then there was Richard Jackson, a naval officer whose reputation for violence preceded him wherever he went. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The choice seemed impossible, each option promising a different form of misery. But as Betty stood there, her mind racing, she remembered the stories she had heard in the taverns near the docks, stories of another man, one not present in the governor's study, but whose reputation sailed on every wind that crossed the Caribbean. Louis King, the pirate captain who commanded both fear and strange respect among those who knew the seas. "Governor Turner," she had said, her voice steadier than she felt, "you said I could choose any man to marry. Does this offer extend beyond these 3 gentlemen?" Turner's eyebrows had raised, intrigued by her boldness. "What do you have in mind, Miss Morgan?" "I choose Louis King." The silence that followed was deafening. Eric Howard's face had flushed red with indignation, while Brandon Nelson's perpetual smile finally faltered. Richard Jackson's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, as if the mere mention of the pirate's name was a personal affront. "The pirate?" Turner had laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "My dear girl, you cannot be serious. The man is an outlaw, a criminal of the worst sort." "But he is a man," Betty had replied, lifting her chin with defiance she did not know she possessed. "And you said I could choose any man." "I choose him." Turner had studied her for a long moment, his calculating mind working behind his pale eyes. "Very well," he had said finally. "If you can convince Louis King to marry you and settle your father's debts, I will honor the arrangement. But when he refuses, as he surely will, you will return here and choose from these 3 gentlemen without further protest." Betty had agreed, knowing she was likely walking toward her own destruction, but unable to bear the thought of surrendering to any of the 3 men before her. At least with Louis King, she would face the unknown, rather than the certain horror of a life with men whose reputations spoke of nothing but cruelty and death. Finding Louis King had proven easier than she had expected. The Serpent's Kiss was anchored in a secluded cove on the far side of the island, hidden from the patrol routes of the Royal Navy, but known to those who moved in the shadows of legitimate society. Betty had hired a fisherman to take her there, using the last of her mother's jewelry to pay for passage. The ship was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Its black hull gleamed in the tropical sun, and its sails bore the unmistakable marks of battle. Cannon ports lined its sides like watching eyes, and the crew that moved about its deck looked like they had stepped from her darkest nightmares. Yet there was something about the vessel that spoke of pride and purpose, a sense that this was more than just a pirate ship, but a home for those who had nowhere else to belong. Louis King had been standing at the bow when she climbed aboard, his back to her as he gazed out at the endless expanse of blue water. When he turned, Betty's breath had caught in her throat. The stories had not prepared her for the reality of the man. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face bore the marks of a hard life, scars that spoke of battles fought and survived, but there was an intelligence there that surprised her. "Miss Morgan," he had said, and she realized he already knew who she was. "I wondered when you would come. You know why I am here?" Word travels fast in Port Royal. The governor's offer has been the talk of every tavern and brothel from here to Tortuga. He had studied her with those storm gray eyes, taking in her simple dress and the determined set of her jaw. "The question is, why did you choose me?" Betty had rehearsed this moment during the long boat ride, but now, faced with the reality of Louis King, her carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. "Because you are the only one of my options who has not built his reputation on the suffering of innocence." Louis had laughed, but it was not a cruel sound. "You know nothing about me, Miss Morgan. I am a pirate. I have killed men, taken ships, and stolen more gold than most people see in a lifetime. What makes you think I am any different from the others?" "Because," she had said, her voice growing stronger with conviction, "you have never taken a slave ship. You have never harmed a woman or child. And when the hurricane struck Port Royal last year, it was your crew who pulled survivors from the wreckage while the governor's soldiers stood by and watched." Something had shifted in Louis' expression then, a flicker of surprise that he quickly masked. "You have done your research." "I had to. My life depends on this choice." Louis had been quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to read the truth written there. Around them, the crew continued their work, but Betty could feel their eyes upon her, weighing and measuring this woman who had dared to board their ship uninvited. "Marriage is not a game, Miss Morgan," Louis had said finally, "nor is it a business arrangement to be entered into lightly. What makes you think I would agree to such a thing?" "Because you understand what it means to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control," Betty had replied. "And because I am offering you something no one else ever has." "Which is?" "A choice. Marry me and you gain legitimacy, a governor's sanction, however reluctant, protection from the worst of the bounty hunters. And in return, I ask only that you treat me with the respect you would show any member of your crew." Louis had considered this, his eyes never leaving her face. "And if I refuse? Then I return to Port Royal and marry one of 3 men who will see me as nothing more than property to be used and discarded. But at least I will have tried to forge my own path." The silence that followed had stretched between them like a taut rope, filled with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. Finally, Louis had nodded slowly. "Very well, Miss Morgan, I accept your proposal. But understand this, if you are to be my wife, you will live by the rules of this ship and this crew. The sea does not care about your breeding or your education. It will kill you just as quickly as any man if you are not prepared to fight for your survival." Betty had felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. She had won her gamble, but now she faced the reality of what that victory meant. Life aboard a pirate ship was not the romantic adventure of the stories she had read. It was hard, dangerous, and unforgiving. The wedding ceremony had taken place 3 days later on the deck of the Serpent's Kiss, with Sarah Taylor, the ship's cook and the only other woman aboard, serving as witness. The crew had gathered around them, a motley collection of men from every corner of the world, united by their loyalty to Louis King and their rejection of the society that had cast them out. The ceremony itself had been simple, almost stark in its brevity. There was no priest, no flowers, no music save the sound of wind in the rigging and waves against the hull. Louis had spoken the words with the same gravity he brought to every decision, his voice carrying across the deck with quiet authority. Betty had found herself surprised by the sincerity in his tone, the way he looked directly into her eyes as he pledged to protect and honor her. When it was done, the crew had cheered and shared what rum they had, but Betty had noticed that Louis remained apart from the celebration, his eyes already turning toward the horizon, as if calculating their next move. She had begun to understand that for him, this marriage was indeed a business arrangement, a strategic alliance that served both their purposes, but carried no expectation of affection or intimacy. The first weeks aboard the Serpent's Kiss had tested every assumption Betty had ever held about herself. The ship was a world unto itself, with its own laws, customs, and rhythms. She learned to move with the roll of the deck, to secure her belongings against the sudden storms that could arise without warning, and to find her place among men who had initially viewed her with suspicion and curiosity. Sarah Taylor had become her guide and protector during those early days. The older woman had joined the crew 5 years earlier after her husband, a merchant sailor, had been pressed into service by the Royal Navy and never returned. She had nowhere else to go and skills that made her valuable, so Lewis had accepted her into his crew with the same pragmatic assessment he applied to everything else. "The captain is a good man," Sarah had told Betty one evening as they prepared the crew's dinner in the ship's galley. "But he is not an easy man. He has seen too much, lost too much, to trust readily. If you want to earn his respect, you must prove yourself useful. Pretty faces and gentle breeding mean nothing out here." Betty had taken this advice to heart, throwing herself into learning every aspect of ship life. She helped Sarah in the galley, learning to prepare meals that would keep in the tropical heat and provide nutrition for men doing hard physical labor. She assisted Laura Lewis, the ship's navigator, in maintaining the charts and calculating their position using the stars. Most importantly, she learned to handle weapons, understanding that in their world, the ability to defend oneself was not optional, but essential. Lewis had watched her efforts with what seemed like detached interest, neither encouraging nor discouraging her attempts to integrate into the crew. He treated her with unfailing courtesy, but maintained a distance that made it clear their marriage was a matter of convenience rather than affection. They shared a cabin, but he had strung a hammock for himself and left the narrow bunk for her use, creating a physical barrier that matched the emotional one between them. It was during their first real battle that everything changed. A Spanish galleon had appeared on the horizon, heavily laden with treasure from the New World and inadequately defended. Lewis had called for battle stations, and Betty had found herself swept up in the controlled chaos of preparing for combat. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role and executing it without hesitation. "Stay below," Lewis had commanded her as the two ships drew closer together. "This is not a place for you." But Betty had refused, her chin set in the same stubborn line that had carried her through her confrontation with Governor Turner. "I am part of this crew now. I will not hide while others fight." Lewis had looked as if he wanted to argue, but there was no time. The Spanish ship had opened fire, and the battle was upon them. Betty had found herself loading muskets and passing ammunition, her hands steady despite the thunder of cannons and the screams of wounded men. When a Spanish boarding party had tried to take the deck, she had stood her ground with a cutlass in her hand, fighting alongside men who had initially seen her as nothing more than their captain's burden. The victory had been decisive but costly. 3 of their crew had been killed, and several others wounded. As Betty helped Sarah tend to the injured, she had felt Lewis's eyes upon her, his expression unreadable. When the immediate crisis had passed and the captured treasure secured, he had approached her with something like respect in his storm-gray eyes. "You fought well," he had said simply, but Betty had heard the acknowledgement in his voice, the recognition that she had proven herself worthy of her place among them. From that day forward, the dynamic between them had begun to shift. Lewis still maintained his careful distance, but Betty sensed a growing awareness in the way he looked at her, a recognition that she was more than just a convenient solution to a political problem. She, in turn, found herself studying him with new eyes, seeing past the fearsome reputation to the man beneath. Lewis King, she discovered, was a man of contradictions. He could be utterly ruthless in battle, showing no mercy to those who threatened his crew or his ship. Yet she had also seen him spend hours teaching a young crew member to read, his patience infinite as he guided the boy through the mysteries of letters and words. He commanded absolute loyalty from his men, but it was a loyalty earned through consistent fairness and a willingness to share both dangers and rewards equally. The crew itself was a revelation to Betty. These were not the bloodthirsty monsters of popular imagination, but men who had been cast out by society for various reasons and had found a new family aboard the Serpent's Kiss. There was Deborah Garcia, who had disguised herself as a man to escape an arranged marriage and had maintained the deception for so long that most of the crew had forgotten she was a woman. Sandra Sanchez served as the ship's doctor, her knowledge of herbs and healing arts making her invaluable in a world where medical care was often a matter of life and death. As the weeks turned to months, Betty found herself settling into the rhythm of shipboard life. She developed calluses on her hands from handling rope and sail, and her skin grew brown from constant exposure to sun and salt spray. The fine gowns she had brought from Port Royal were replaced by practical clothing that could withstand the demands of life at sea. She was becoming something she had never imagined possible. A woman defined not by her marriage prospects or social standing, but by her own capabilities and choices. The change in her relationship with Lewis was subtle but unmistakable. The careful courtesy remained, but it was now accompanied by a growing intimacy of shared experience. They stood watch together in the pre-dawn hours, comfortable in each other's silence as they watched for signs of other ships on the horizon. He began to consult her on matters of strategy and navigation, valuing her educated perspective on the political situation in the various ports they visited. It was during one of these quiet conversations that Betty finally understood the man she had married. They were anchored in a secluded lagoon, taking on fresh water and making repairs to the ship after a particularly violent storm. Louis had been studying charts by lamplight, plotting their next course, when Betty had joined him in the cabin they nominally shared. "Why did you become a pirate?" she had asked, the question that had been burning in her mind for months finally finding voice. Louis had looked up from his charts, his expression guarded. For a moment, she thought he would deflect the question as he had so many others. But then something in his face had softened, and he had set down his compass. "I was a naval officer once," he had said, his voice quiet in the lamplight. "Lieutenant Louis King of His Majesty's Navy, sworn to uphold the law and protect British interests in the Caribbean. I believed in duty, honor, all the noble ideals they teach young men who are foolish enough to think the world operates on principles rather than power." He had paused, his eyes distant with memory. "My ship was ordered to escort a convoy of slave ships from the Gold Coast to Jamaica. 300 souls packed into holds barely fit for cargo, dying of disease and despair, while my fellow officers counted profits and planned how to spend their shares. When I protested the conditions, I was told that slaves were property, not people, and that my job was to ensure the cargo arrived intact, not to concern myself with its comfort." Betty had felt her breath catch, understanding beginning to dawn. The night before we reached Port Royal, a storm hit. The slave ships were taking on water, and their captains were preparing to jettison their human cargo to save their vessels. I could not stand by and watch 300 people drown for the sake of profit. I took a boat and began ferrying people to safety, directly disobeying orders. What happened? I was court-martialed for insubordination and destruction of property, stripped of my commission and sentenced to hang. I escaped the night before my execution, stole a ship, and became the very thing the Navy had trained me to fight. Louis had met her eyes then, and she had seen the pain and defiance that had driven him to this life. I chose to become a pirate rather than remain complicit in a system that treats human beings as commodities. The revelation had changed everything between them. Betty had reached across the table and taken his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his transformation from naval officer to outlaw. In that moment, she had understood that their marriage, begun as a desperate gambit for freedom, had become something deeper and more genuine than either of them had expected. The attack came at dawn, 3 ships bearing the colors of the Royal Navy appearing on the horizon like harbingers of judgment. Betty had been on deck helping to secure the morning catch, when the lookout's cry split the air. Louis was beside her in moments, his spyglass trained on the approaching vessels, his face grim with recognition. "It's Turner," he had said, lowering the glass. "The governor has finally decided to collect his bride." The crew had sprung into action with the efficiency born of countless battles, but Betty could see the concern in their faces. 3 ships to 1 were poor odds, even for the legendary Serpent's Kiss. Louis had begun barking orders, preparing for the fight of their lives, when Betty had made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. "Let me go to them," she had said, her voice carrying across the deck with surprising strength. "If I surrender myself, they might let the ship go." Louis had turned to her with something like fury in his storm-gray eyes. You are not cargo to be traded, Betty. You are my wife and a member of this crew. We do not abandon our own. And I will not be the cause of your death or the death of these men who have become my family. Betty had replied, her chin set in the stubborn line he had come to know so well. This is my choice, Lewis. Let me make it. The battle that followed had been unlike anything in Betty's experience. The Serpent's Kiss was fast and maneuverable, but the Navy ships had superior firepower and the advantage of numbers. Lewis had fought with the skill and desperation of a man protecting everything he held dear. His commands clear and precise, even as cannonballs whistled overhead and the deck ran red with blood. Betty had found herself in the thick of the fighting, loading muskets and tending wounded men while the world exploded around her. She had seen Sandra Sanchez fall with a musket ball in her shoulder, had watched Deborah Garcia leap from the rigging to engage a boarding party with nothing but a cutlass and raw courage. These people had risked everything for her, had accepted her as one of their own, and now they were dying because of choices she had made. When the governor's flagship had finally closed within hailing distance, Betty had made her move. Ignoring Lewis's shouted protests, she had climbed to the highest point of the rigging, her white shirt a flag of surrender against the blue Caribbean sky. "Governor Turner," she had called across the water, her voice carrying on the wind, "I am here. Call off your attack, and I will come aboard your ship willingly." The guns had fallen silent, an eerie quiet settling over the water as the two forces faced each other across 100 yards of churning sea. Turner's voice had carried back, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "Mrs. King, you will return to Port Royal to face charges of treason and conspiracy. Your pirate husband will hang, and his crew will face justice for their crimes." "No," Betty had replied, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I will come with you, but only if you allow the Serpent's Kiss to sail away unharmed. You have what you came for. Let that be enough." The negotiation that followed had been tense and complex, conducted across the water while both sides remained at battle stations. Turner wanted Lewis King's head as a trophy, but he also recognized the political value of reclaiming the governor's ward who had so publicly defied his authority. In the end, pragmatism had won out over vengeance. Betty had been transferred to the governor's ship in a small boat, her hands bound and her wedding dress torn from the battle. As she had climbed aboard the HMS Retribution, she had looked back to see Lewis standing at the rail of his ship, his face a mask of barely controlled fury and something deeper that might have been heartbreak. "This is not over," he had called to her, his voice carrying across the water like a promise and a threat. The journey back to Port Royal had been a nightmare of recriminations and threats. Governor Turner had made it clear that Betty's defiance had embarrassed him personally and politically, and that her punishment would serve as an example to others who might consider challenging his authority. She would be tried for treason, and if convicted, she would face either execution or transportation to the penal colonies. The trial had been a spectacle designed more for political theater than justice. Betty had stood in the dock of the Port Royal courthouse, her hands chained and her head held high, while Turner's prosecutors had painted her as a traitor who had consorted with enemies of the crown. The evidence against her was overwhelming and largely irrelevant to the charges. She had indeed married a pirate, had indeed lived aboard his ship and participated in actions that could be construed as piracy. But Betty had refused to show remorse or beg for mercy. When given the opportunity to speak in her own defense, she had stood before the packed courtroom and delivered a speech that would be remembered long after the legal proceedings were forgotten. "Gentlemen of the jury," she had begun, her voice clear and strong despite the chains that bound her hands. "You have heard the charges against me, and I will not insult your intelligence by denying the facts. I did indeed marry Louis King, knowing him to be a pirate. I did live aboard his ship and participate in the life of his crew. But I ask you to consider why I made these choices and what they say about the society that forced them upon me." She had gone on to describe the impossible choice Governor Turner had presented her. The three men whose reputations for cruelty were well known to everyone in the courtroom. She had spoken of the debt that had enslaved her family, the system that treated women as property to be bought and sold for the convenience of men. And she had spoken of Lewis King, not as the monster of popular imagination, but as a man who had chosen honor over obedience, Justice over law. I am accused of treason, she had concluded. But I ask you, what greater treason is there than a society that forces its daughters to choose between different forms of slavery? I chose freedom, and if that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then I accept that judgment. But I will not apologize for refusing to be a victim of circumstances I did not create. The jury had deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Betty had shown no emotion as the judge had sentenced her to transportation to the penal colonies of Australia, a fate that was considered only marginally better than death. She would spend the rest of her life in bondage, her crime being the audacity to choose her own path in a world that demanded female submission. But as Betty had been led from the courtroom in chains, she had noticed something that gave her hope. The faces in the crowd were not uniformly hostile. She had seen sympathy in the eyes of women who understood the impossible choices she had faced. Admiration in the faces of men who respected her courage even if they could not condone her actions. Her defiance had planted seeds of doubt about the justice of a system that punished people for refusing to accept their assigned roles. The prison ship that would carry her to Australia was scheduled to depart in 3 days, giving Betty time to contemplate the life that awaited her. The penal colonies were harsh places where convicts worked under conditions little better than slavery, their only hope for freedom lying in the completion of sentences that often stretched for decades. It was a slow death designed to break the spirit as thoroughly as the body. On her final night in Port Royal, as Betty lay on the straw mattress of her cell, listening to the sounds of the harbor beyond the prison walls, she had allowed herself to think of Louis King. Was he still sailing the Caribbean, or had Turner's ships finally run him to ground? Had he tried to rescue her, or had he accepted her sacrifice and moved on with his life? She would probably never know, but the memory of their brief marriage had given her something precious. The knowledge that she was capable of making her own choices, even when those choices led to suffering. The sound of keys in her cell door had interrupted her reverie. Betty had expected to see the guard who brought her meager meals, but instead a figure in a hooded cloak had slipped into the cell, moving with the silent grace of someone accustomed to stealth. When the hood had fallen back, Betty's heart had nearly stopped. It was Laura Lewis, the navigator from the Serpent's Kiss, her face grim with determination and her hands steady as she worked at Betty's shackles with a set of lockpicks. "The captain sends his regards," Laura had whispered as the chains fell away, "and his apologies for taking so long to arrange this." The escape had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that Lewis brought to every operation. A small boat waited at the harbor's edge, crewed by men Betty recognized from the Serpent's Kiss. The prison guards had been drugged, their evening meal laced with a sleeping potion that would keep them unconscious for hours. By the time the alarm was raised, Betty and her rescuers would be far from Port Royal, racing across the dark water toward freedom. The reunion with Lewis had taken place aboard the Serpent's Kiss as the ship sailed through the pre-dawn darkness, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the inevitable pursuit. Betty had climbed aboard to find the crew lined up on deck, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and fierce joy at her return. But it was Lewis's expression that had stopped her breath, the carefully controlled mask finally slipping to reveal the depth of his feelings. "I thought I had lost you," he had said, his voice rough with emotion as he pulled her into his arms. "I thought Turner would kill you before I could find a way to get you back." "I made my choice," Betty had replied, her hands tangling in his dark hair, "just as you made yours all those years ago, when you chose honor over obedience. We are both criminals now, both outcasts from the world we were born into. But we are free to choose our own path." The kiss that followed had been fierce and desperate, a claiming and a promise that spoke of all the words they had never said. When they finally broke apart, Betty had seen her own transformation reflected in Lewis's storm-gray eyes. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had boarded his ship months ago, seeking escape from an impossible situation. She had become someone new, someone forged by fire and salt water into a woman who could stand beside him as an equal. The weeks that followed had been a time of adjustment and discovery. Betty's escape had made her as notorious as her husband, her name spoken in the same breath as his in the taverns and brothels of the Caribbean. Governor Turner had placed a substantial bounty on both their heads, but the very audacity of her rescue had elevated her to legendary status among those who lived outside the law. More importantly, the dynamic between Betty and Lewis had finally evolved into the partnership she had always hoped it might become. The careful distance he had maintained was replaced by a growing intimacy that encompassed both the physical and emotional aspects of marriage. They stood watch together, planned operations together, and faced the dangers of their chosen life as true partners. Betty had also found her place within the crew's hierarchy, her intelligence and education making her valuable in ways that went beyond her ability to handle weapons or work the rigging. She became Lewis's advisor on political matters, helping him navigate the complex web of alliances and enmities that defined the Caribbean's criminal underworld. Her knowledge of society's inner workings proved invaluable in planning operations and avoiding the traps that Turner and other authorities set for them. The crew itself had evolved as well, growing from a collection of outcasts into something resembling a family. New members joined them regularly, drawn by the reputation of a ship where loyalty was rewarded and competence valued over birth or background. Sarah Taylor had taken on the role of unofficial mother to the younger crew members, while Sandra Sanchez's medical skills had saved more lives than anyone could count. It was during this period of relative stability that Betty had begun to understand the true nature of the life she had chosen. Piracy was not the romantic adventure of popular stories, but a constant struggle for survival in a world that offered no mercy to those who lived outside its laws. Every sunrise brought new dangers, every port held potential enemies, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death for the entire crew. Yet there was also a freedom in this life that Betty had never experienced in civilized society. Aboard the Serpent's Kiss, her worth was measured by her contributions rather than her gender or social standing. She could speak her mind without fear of social consequences, could act according to her own moral compass rather than society's expectations. It was a harsh freedom, bought with constant vigilance and paid for in blood, but it was genuine in a way that her previous life had never been. The crisis that would test everything they had built together came without warning, as such things always did at sea. They had been pursuing a Spanish treasure fleet, following intelligence that promised the richest prize any of them had ever attempted. The operation required precise timing and flawless execution, with multiple ships working in coordination to overcome the fleet's escorts. Everything had gone wrong from the beginning. The intelligence had been faulty, the treasure fleet more heavily guarded than expected, and their supposed allies had betrayed them at the crucial moment. The Serpent's Kiss found itself outnumbered and outgunned, fighting for its life against overwhelming odds, while Spanish warships closed in from all sides. Louis had fought with the desperate skill of a man who knew that defeat meant death, not just for himself but for everyone he cared about. The crew had responded with the fierce loyalty that he had earned through years of fair treatment and shared dangers. But even their best efforts seemed insufficient against the forces arrayed against them. It was Betty who had spotted the weakness in the Spanish formation, a gap between two ships that might allow them to break through if they could time their approach perfectly. She had climbed to the crow's nest with a spyglass, studying the enemy movements while cannonballs whistled around her, calculating angles and distances with the precision of a trained navigator. There, she had called down to Lewis, pointing toward the gap she had identified. "If we can reach that opening in the next 10 minutes, we might have a chance." Lewis had looked up at her, his face streaked with powder smoke and blood, and Betty had seen the moment when he made the decision to trust her judgment completely. "All hands," he had bellowed, his voice carrying across the chaos of battle. "Prepare to come about. We're going through them, not around them." The maneuver that followed had required every skill the crew possessed and more courage than any of them knew they had. The Serpent's Kiss had turned directly toward the enemy line, presenting its most vulnerable angle to the Spanish guns, while building speed for the desperate run through the gap. Betty had remained in the crow's nest, calling out corrections to their course as the enemy ships adjusted their positions to close the opening. The moment of truth had come as they approached the narrowest part of the gap, Spanish cannons roaring from both sides while the crew fought to keep their ship on course. Betty had felt the mast shudder beneath her as a cannonball struck just below her position. splinters of wood flying like deadly rain. But she had held her position, continuing to guide Lewis through the treacherous passage until they burst through into clear water beyond. The escape that followed had been a masterpiece of seamanship and navigation, with Lewis pushing the Serpent's Kiss to its absolute limits while the Spanish ships struggled to reorganize their pursuit. Betty had worked alongside Laura Lewis to plot their course through the maze of islands and reefs that dotted this part of the Caribbean, using her knowledge of local currents and weather patterns to find hiding places where their pursuers could not follow. When they finally reached safety in a secluded lagoon known only to the most experienced pirates, the crew had erupted in celebration. They had not only survived impossible odds, but had done so through the kind of teamwork and mutual trust that could not be bought or commanded. Betty had climbed down from the rigging to find Lewis waiting for her, his eyes bright with pride and something deeper that made her heart race. "You saved us all," he had said, pulling her into his arms while the crew cheered around them. "Your quick thinking and courage made the difference between life and death." "We saved each other," Betty had replied, her hands framing his face as she looked into his storm-gray eyes. "That's what partners do." The kiss that followed had been witnessed by the entire crew, a public declaration of the love that had grown between them through months of shared danger and mutual respect. When they finally broke apart, Betty had seen approval and affection in the faces around them, the recognition that their captain and his wife had found something rare and precious in a world that offered few such gifts. The months that followed their narrow escape marked a new chapter in the life of the Serpent's Kiss and its crew. Betty had proven herself not just as Lewis's wife, but as a valuable member of the team in her own right, her strategic thinking and navigational skills earning the respect of even the most hardened veterans. The crew began to defer to her judgment in matters that fell within her expertise, and Lewis consulted her on every major decision affecting their operations. Their reputation had grown as well, stories of their daring escape spreading throughout the Caribbean's criminal underworld. The tale of the governor's ward, who had chosen a pirate over civilized society, who had been rescued from the very steps of the gallows and had then helped her crew escape impossible odds, became the stuff of legend. Sailors in every port knew their names, and even their enemies spoke of them with grudging respect. But fame brought its own dangers. Governor Turner's pursuit had become personal, his hatred for the couple who had humiliated him driving him to increasingly desperate measures. He had placed bounties on their heads that attracted every fortune hunter and naval officer in the Caribbean, turning every port into a potential trap and every encounter with strangers into a life-or-death gamble. It was during this period of heightened danger that Betty had begun to understand the true cost of the life she had chosen. The constant vigilance required to stay alive took its toll on everyone aboard the ship, creating a tension that could explode into violence at the slightest provocation. Relationships that had seemed solid began to show cracks under the pressure, and more than once Lewis had been forced to mediate disputes that might have torn the crew apart. The breaking point had come during what should have been a routine stop for supplies and fresh water. They had anchored in a cove that had always been safe, a hidden refuge known only to a select few in the pirate community. But Turner's agents had been watching, waiting for exactly such an opportunity to strike. The attack had come at dawn just as it had months earlier, but this time the enemy had learned from their previous encounter. Instead of a direct assault, they had used fire ships, vessels loaded with combustible materials and set ablaze before being sent drifting toward the Serpent's Kiss. The crew had awakened to find their escape route blocked by walls of flame, while Turner's ships closed in from the open sea. Lewis had responded with the calm professionalism that had kept them alive through countless dangers. But Betty could see the strain in his face as he calculated their dwindling options. They were trapped in a cove with limited room to maneuver, facing an enemy who had learned to counter their greatest advantages. The situation seemed hopeless, but surrender was not an option any of them would consider. "We'll have to fight our way out," Lewis had said, his voice steady despite the impossible odds they faced. "If we can reach open water, we still have a chance." Betty had studied the tactical situation from her position in the rigging, her mind racing through possibilities and alternatives. The fire ships were the key to Turner's strategy, creating a barrier that prevented their escape while herding them toward the waiting guns of the naval vessels. But fire was a weapon that cut both ways, as dangerous to those who wielded it as to their intended victims. The wind, she had called down to Lewis, her voice carrying a note of desperate hope. If we can change the wind direction, we can turn their own fire ships against them. Lewis had looked up at her with the expression of a man grasping at straws, but willing to trust in her judgment even when logic suggested defeat. How do we change the wind, Betty? We don't change it, she had replied, her mind working through the complex calculations required. We use it. The morning thermal will shift the breeze in 20 minutes. If we can hold out that long and position ourselves correctly, we can use their fire ships as a screen while we break for open water. The 20 minutes that followed had been the longest of Betty's life. The crew had fought with desperate courage, holding their position while the fire ships drifted closer and Spanish cannons pounded their hull. Sarah Taylor had been wounded in the first exchange, a musket ball shattering her left arm, while Sandra Sanchez had worked frantically to treat the injured under impossible conditions. Betty had remained in the rigging, watching the smoke patterns and feeling the subtle changes in air pressure that would signal the wind shift. When the moment finally came, she had called out the course correction that would either save them all or send them directly into the flames. The gamble had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. The shifting wind had indeed turned the fire ships into a protective screen, their flames and smoke concealing the Serpent's kiss as it made its desperate run for open water. Turner's ships had been forced to hold their fire to avoid hitting their own vessels, giving Lewis the precious minutes he needed to reach the open sea. But the escape had come at a terrible cost. 3 crew members had been killed in the fighting, including Deborah Garcia, who had died defending the ship's wheel from a Spanish boarding party. Sandra Sanchez's medical supplies had been destroyed in the fire, leaving her unable to properly treat the wounded. And the ship itself had taken damage that would require weeks of careful repair work to fully address. Most painful of all, Sarah Taylor's injury had proven more serious than initially thought. The musket ball had shattered bone and severed arteries, and despite Sandra's best efforts, infection had set in during the days that followed their escape. She had died quietly one evening as the sun set over the Caribbean, her last words a message of thanks to Lewis for giving her a home when she had nowhere else to go. The funeral had been held at sea, as was the custom among pirates. With Sarah's body committed to the depths that had been her home for the last years of her life, Betty had spoken at the service, her voice carrying across the water as she paid tribute to a woman who had shown her the meaning of true courage and loyalty. The crew had listened in silence, each man and woman understanding that they had lost not just a shipmate, but a piece of their collective soul. In the days that followed, Betty had found herself taking on many of Sarah's responsibilities, working in the galley and caring for the wounded, while the ship limped toward a safe harbor where they could make repairs. It was during this period of grief and recovery that she had begun to understand the true nature of the family she had joined. These people were bound together not by blood or law, but by shared hardship and mutual dependence, creating bonds that were stronger than any conventional relationship. Lewis had aged visibly during the crisis, the weight of command and the loss of crew members etching new lines around his storm-gray eyes. He had always carried the burden of leadership, but Betty could see that each death diminished him in ways that went beyond the tactical considerations of maintaining crew strength. These people had entrusted him with their lives, and when that trust resulted in their deaths, he bore the responsibility as a personal failure. It was during one of their quiet conversations in the ship's cabin that Betty had finally understood the depth of his pain and the source of his seemingly inexhaustible strength. They had been discussing the need to recruit new crew members, a practical necessity that felt like a betrayal of those they had lost. When Lewis had suddenly stopped talking and stared out at the dark water beyond their anchorage. Sometimes I wonder if I have the right to ask people to follow me. Follow me, he had said, his voice barely audible above the sound of waves against the hull. Every decision I make puts lives at risk, and every mistake costs someone their future. Sarah trusted me to keep her safe, and I failed her. Betty had taken his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life at sea. You didn't fail her, Lewis. You gave her 5 years of freedom and purpose. 5 years where she was valued for her contributions rather than pitied for her losses. She chose this life, just as I did, just as everyone aboard this ship has done. We follow you not because you promise safety, but because you offer something more precious than safety. You offer the chance to live according to our own choices rather than society's expectations. The conversation had marked a turning point in their relationship, the moment when Betty had fully understood the man she had married and the life she had chosen. Lewis was not the fearsome pirate of popular imagination, but a man who had chosen to bear the weight of leadership because someone had to, who had accepted the responsibility of caring for those who had nowhere else to go. His strength came not from ruthlessness, but from an unwavering commitment to the people who had placed their trust in him. As the Serpent's Kiss had slowly healed from its wounds, taking on new crew members and rebuilding its strength, Betty had found her own role evolving as well. She was no longer the governor's ward who had chosen a pirate over civilized society, but a leader in her own right, someone whose judgment was valued and whose courage had been proven in the crucible of battle. The crew looked to her not just as their captain's wife, but as a partner in the enterprise that had become their shared life. The final confrontation with Governor Turner had come not through his design, but through theirs. After months of being hunted like animals, Lewis and Betty had decided to take the initiative, to end the pursuit that had cost so many lives and threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The plan they had devised was audacious in its simplicity. They would capture Turner himself, forcing the authorities to negotiate for his release rather than continuing their relentless pursuit. The operation had required every skill they possessed and the cooperation of allies throughout the Caribbean's criminal underworld. Turner's movements had been tracked and analyzed, his security arrangements studied and countered, until they found the perfect opportunity to strike. He would be traveling from Port Royal to Spanish Town with only a small escort, confident that his enemies would never dare to attack him on land. Betty had insisted on leading the shore party that would capture the governor, her knowledge of his habits and the local terrain making her the logical choice despite Lewis's concerns for her safety. She had assembled a team of the ship's most skilled fighters, including Laura Lewis and two new crew members whose loyalty had been proven in recent battles. The ambush had gone perfectly. Turner's carriage stopped by a carefully placed tree across the mountain road while masked figures emerged from the jungle on both sides. The governor's guards had been overwhelmed before they could mount an effective resistance, and Turner himself had been taken prisoner without a shot being fired. Within an hour, he was aboard the Serpent's Kiss, confined to a cabin under heavy guard, while Lewis and Betty decided his fate. The negotiation that followed had been conducted through intermediaries, with Turner's second-in-command authorized to speak for the colonial government. The terms Betty and Lewis had offered were surprisingly reasonable. Turner's life in exchange for an end to the official pursuit, a general amnesty for the crew of the Serpent's Kiss, and safe passage to leave the Caribbean if they chose to do so. Turner himself had been a model prisoner, his aristocratic composure never wavering despite the circumstances of his captivity. When Betty had visited him in his makeshift cell, she had found him reading one of the books from Lewis's personal library, his manner as calm as if he were in his own study rather than aboard a pirate ship. "You have changed considerably since our last meeting, Mrs. King," he had observed, setting down the book to study her with the same calculating gaze she remembered from their first encounter. "The frightened girl who stood in my office has become quite the formidable woman." "I had excellent teachers," Betty had replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Hardship and necessity have a way of revealing what we are truly capable of." Turner had nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed they do. I must admit, I underestimated you from the beginning. I saw only a desperate young woman seeking to escape an unpleasant fate, not someone capable of the kind of strategic thinking you have displayed." "You saw what society taught you to see," Betty had said. "A woman's worth measured only by her marriage prospects and her willingness to submit to male authority. You never considered that I might have value beyond my ability to settle my father's debts." The exchange had continued for nearly an hour, a civilized conversation between enemies who had gained a grudging respect for each other's capabilities. Turner had acknowledged that his pursuit of them had become personal, driven more by wounded pride than by any real threat they posed to colonial authority. Betty had explained the choices that had led her to Lewis's ship and the life she had built there, helping Turner understand that she was not a victim to be rescued, but a woman who had found her true calling. When the negotiations were finally concluded and Turner released unharmed to his own people, both sides had honored their agreement. The official pursuit of the Serpent's Kiss had ended, and Lewis's crew had been granted the amnesty they had been promised. Turner had even provided them with letters of marque, documents that would allow them to operate as privateers rather than pirates, giving them a measure of legal protection for their activities. But the most significant outcome of their confrontation with Turner had been the recognition that their time in the Caribbean was drawing to a close. The world was changing, and the age of piracy that had given them refuge was slowly coming to an end. New technologies and changing political realities were making it increasingly difficult for ships like theirs to operate, and many of their contemporaries had already chosen to retire or seek their fortunes elsewhere. Standing on the deck of the Serpent's Kiss as it sailed toward the sunset, Betty had reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years earlier, she had been a frightened young woman facing an impossible choice, trapped by circumstances beyond her control and society's expectations. Now she was the partner of one of the Caribbean's most respected captains, a woman whose courage and intelligence had been proven in the crucible of battle and storm. The transformation had not been easy or without cost. She had lost friends, faced death more times than she cared to count, and been forced to make choices that would have been unthinkable in her previous life. But she had also gained something precious beyond measure: the knowledge that she was capable of shaping her own destiny, that her worth was not determined by others, but by her own actions and choices. Lewis had joined her at the rail, his arms slipping around her waist as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. The future stretched before them like an uncharted sea, full of possibilities and dangers in equal measure. They would face whatever came together, as partners and equals, their love forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the salt spray of countless storms. "No regrets?" Lewis had asked, his voice soft in the evening air. Betty had smiled, her hand covering his where it rested on her waist. "Only that it took me so long to find the courage to choose my own path. But perhaps that was necessary too. Perhaps I needed to understand what I was rejecting before I could fully appreciate what I had found." The Serpent's Kiss had sailed on into the gathering darkness, carrying its crew toward whatever adventures awaited them beyond the horizon. Behind them, the lights of civilization faded into memory, but ahead lay the infinite possibilities of the open sea and the promise of a life lived according to their own choices rather than society's expectations. Betty Morgan King had found her freedom at last, and she would never willingly surrender it again.